Hello, everybody. I hope that things are going well for you today. We have a great guest on today who's going to be talking. We're going to be talking about education, especially in times of COVID and online learning and all this kind of stuff. So Nicole Barbaro, she was the 0th episode of these kinds of live discussion type things. And we're happy to have her back, especially now that we have all the technical issues shaken out. So welcome, Nicole. Why don't you go ahead and introduce yourself?
Yeah, well, thanks for having me back, and thanks to all of you watching that are interested in this. So a little bit of my background: I'm a psychologist by training. I have my PhD in experimental psychology. I focus primarily on human evolution and development. Since graduating, I've moved more into the higher education and education technology space. So I currently work at a place called WGU Labs, which is like a research and development hub associated with Western Governors University. So my day-to-day, I kind of have my foot in the door of technology, of higher education, and we're technically, nonprofit as well. So kind of a foot in all three spaces. I also teach one course a semester at Utah Valley University. I'm teaching a course on child development this semester. And then I also do communications for the Human Behavior and Evolution Society. So I have a few hats that I wear throughout the week.
Three. And so you get to juggle them, and then you can put them on one at a time.
It sounds way more fun when you describe it like that.
So a couple of questions then, since you are, where do we want to start? Do we want to start with online ed, or do we want to start with in-person classroom ed?
Let's start with the elephant in the room of the in-person
okay.
And online space, I guess. What's going on right now, and we can kind of branch off of issues from there.
Yeah, so how has been, now is this your first semester teaching at Utah Valley?
So I did actually teach last semester, but it was a fully online asynchronous intro psych course, which at Utah Valley, they have kind of like a prepackaged course. So really, I just kind of delivered the course. I had never taught asynchronously before, so it was a very different experience, but this is my first time developing my own course there, actually meeting students. I never saw one student in person last semester.
Yeah, and so with the asynchronous courses, it's like you have to moderate the chat, and like they're supposed to have discussion posts, and
it's a lot of email. Like I'm pretty much just emailing like all week. It's because there's no one time, you're really kind of individually interacting, almost like in a tutoring sense with you, rather than a cohesive course sense. So,
you can't concentrate the students.
Yeah, there's no synchronous cohort events. There's no times and everyone's there. So it was a weird teaching experience. I don't think it was quite my preferred way of teaching. So I'm back in the classroom in person this semester, and I'm having a great time so far. So
a couple questions then. So Utah Valley. What I remembered Utah Valley as being was 4 portable units up on top of a hill. This was in the early to mid 1980s, and then it exploded in terms of the student population. So what can you tell me anything about what does Utah Valley look like today compared to 4 portable units on top of a hill?
Very different. I'm teaching, I haven't had a lot of time to just kind of like explore around campus. It reminds me a lot of my alma mater, Oakland University. So it's a closed campus. So everything's kind of contained within a campus, but there are massive buildings. It's very new. Like the classroom I'm teaching in is in, I think, the newest building on campus. So like there's, like 4 massive flat screens in the room. Like it's very like a high-tech classroom. It's a gorgeous campus. It's really, really nice. So I'm excited to explore more around campus and get to know some of the buildings. I've been in one building with HR to turn in paperwork, and the building that I teach in. So I teach a night class, so I just don't have too much time between rush hour traffic.
Yeah.
And Lehigh.
Well, because you have to go around the point of the mountain. Now, so Utah Valley University, for a few things, historical things for you. Right at Lehigh is where the movie Footloose, the original Footloose movie, was filmed. I think the granary is still there, where they held their like clandestine prom. In that Kevin Bacon film. So I think the granary is still there. If it's not, it was there until just a few years ago. So that's where you get off the exit. But then the mountain that's behind the campus. So there's a campus, and then as you face north, there's the mountain. Are there still always a bunch of hang gliders going off at the top of that peak?
So this is actually the hang gliding. This is a very like separate thing. I haven't actually seen anyone hang gliding, but I recently met someone that does this, and I didn't realize there was a very big community of hang gliders that are just perpetually floating above the valley. So I haven't actually seen them when I looked out, but I'm gonna pay more attention now when I'm outside.
So because that used to be kind of the highlight of we're coming back from California and look at all the hang gliders, and there'd be like a half a dozen of them in the air all the time. Now the north side of that hill, so the mountain comes down, and the south side of the mountain is facing the Utah Valley. The north side faces the Salt Lake Valley, and the north side, that hill used to be called probably still is called in some circles, the Widowmaker. And they used to do motorcycle races from the base of that hill up to the top. And I mean, so they'd be these weird looking motorcycles with big paddles on the wheels and stuff like that. And the goal was to see if you could make it all the way up the hill. And, only a small fraction of the people would do it. And there'd be weird crashes and things like that. So the Widowmaker hill climb, there's quite a bit of video footage online going back to, when I was young, like in the 80s. Of people riding motorcycles, because that used to all be barren wasteland. That whole area around the point of the mountain was completely isolated from everyone, because then they put the penitentiary there, and now it's surrounded by suburbs. Like you break out of prison and you're right in the middle of the suburbs. But
there's quite a bit of houses, at least when you're going south down in the Utah Valley. There's quite a large number of houses along, kind of encroaching onto that little traverse mountain that separates.
So how have is this the first time that Utah Valley has been back in person as this semester, or?
I think primarily in person. Again, last semester I was very new. I got like my course assignment a week before the semester started, trying to figure out how to actually set everything up, because it was the first time using Canvas. I use Moodle and D2L at other institutions, so I was really just kind of getting set up. But from what I understand, most of the classes were online, but now, at least in some of the communications, I think at least 75% of courses are fully in person, and they have to be in person. From my understanding, Utah State passed some legislation that universities have to have a certain proportion of courses in person moving forward. I don't know the details on that, but Utah Valley is primarily in person from what I can understand. Yeah,
so UNLV transitioned to that. We had the option last semester, so spring semester, of doing it in person, as long as your class was small enough. So I had one class of 100 students that was online. So that was, it worked out. It was fine, because I've been doing kind of streaming for a while, so I knew kind of what I was getting into. But I had one class face-to-face that was 15 students, and that was by far the highlight of the semester, was coming in and having actual students in the class. Well, I should say it was top half of the face to top half of the face. And so now I've got a class with 100 and something students enrolled, with only 30 or so that show up every week. So that's a benefit of college, is that they don't take attendance usually. So what has your experience been going back into the classroom, and what have your students said about getting back into the classroom?
Yeah, I am super excited to be back in the classroom. When they were asking for, your availability and things like that for us adjuncts, I was like, I absolutely want an in-person course if you have it. So I was really excited to go back. I've been fully vaccinated, and, I'm pretty comfortable at this point, and, in terms of my personal risk and everything of kind of living life as normal. So I was pretty excited to go back. I was a little nervous, just because I wasn't sure what my students were going to feel like coming back into the classroom. My course has, I think, 27 students enrolled. So, kind of normal size college course. I just wasn't really sure how they were going to, what their level of comfort was, because it's hard to, make assumptions of 27 students. So, when I came in, Utah Valley doesn't have, a mask mandate or anything. It just recently popped up this morning, I think, in response to the recent orders from the White House that now students have to be vaccinated by a certain date. That just recently popped up in my portal, but they don't have a mask mandate on campus, and most students aren't wearing masks from what I've seen. I assume most of them are vaccinated or have made a choice not to be, and are kind of, coming back on campus. I think they're excited. So my first day in the classroom, I was just kind of waiting to observe what my students were most comfortable with and most all of them seem to be totally fine with just holding classes normal. So that's what we've been doing. I also do an intro survey the first day of class, asking about, who they are, why they're here, their major, and just so I can get a feel for the students in my classroom. And I asked them, do they have any concerns about COVID this semester? And the only concern that came up was that they were going to shut down and go online. And seems like no one wanted to go back online. Everyone's excited to come. I have, a full house every Thursday evening. So I teach later tonight, but it feels very normal there. It doesn't feel like this kind of bizarro, stressful tension of higher ed that I've been seeing online.
So that my experience has been similar. Sorry, that my class was full. First day, everyone was there. I know, like, when the test will come around, then everyone will be there again. So it's pretty standard, the attendance that I'm getting. And there were some students who emailed me asking specifically if the class was going to be in person or not. And I was like, yep, that's, as long as we're told that we can be in person, we're going to do it in person. And there's only been one person who's asked for a special dispensation for when I give the test, that, I work something out with them. And for the most part, it seems like students are more happy to be back than leery about being back. Because I'll be honest, my suspicion is that most of the students have been hanging out with their friends anyways. And so it's not really that much different.
Yeah, I would suspect that as well, at least for Utah. And I'm not sure how, Nevada is, but for Utah, it's been fully open for probably almost a year now. So I don't think
there's pretty high church attendance in Utah as well. So
yeah, people are used to being in large groups here. I think, everything's just kind of been open and at full capacity for a long time now here relative to other areas in the country, at least. And especially I know a lot with, Michigan, because that's where I'm from. So a lot of my friends, they're like,
are they jealous?
You're going out and having fun. I'm just like, yeah, sorry.
I
don't think everyone's really convinced.
How was their experience in Michigan different than your experience in Utah?
I remember when we traveled home I think it was over Christmas time last year, which I can't believe it's like mid-September now, but Christmas 2020, Michigan was still pretty, tight, in terms of like capacity and going out, and things weren't really open yet. And all of our friends were just like, we are, not having a good time. I don't know if anyone's been to Michigan in the winter, but it's cold, it's wet, and there's not much to do besides go out to restaurants and bars. It's not this nice winter like we have here in Utah with skiing and, pretty moderate temperatures. It's, like 5 degrees slushy and nasty. So without being able to go out to restaurants and bars, people, were just like, we're just stuck inside all the time. There wasn't really much to do. So, I think it's opened up a little bit more now, but some of my colleagues that I know that are still teaching in Michigan universities, there's, like really heavy mandates in terms of vaccines and masking and, so things like that. So it's less lax than it is here for sure.
So what, in the last year, how has online or like technical aspects of education, what have we learned? Like, what's different now than 18 months ago? Or what have we learned? What's worked? What hasn't worked?
Yeah, and that's a great question. So this is an area that, my kind of day-to-day job at WG Labs, we've been focusing on a lot. Obviously, we're primarily focused on education technology and online learning. So in the same sense that like everything seems to have changed, this past year and a half, also not that much has changed. So in one of our surveys, we, as part of the College Innovation Network that I work with, we have access to, a pretty diverse network of colleges and universities around the country. And we sent out our first annual kind of survey of students and asking them about their experiences with online learning and ed tech. And one of the things that really stood out to me was that although we've had this great opportunity to use all this like interesting new technology to help facilitate learning, the number one thing people are using are just like learning management systems, so your Canvas or, Moodle or Blackboard, whatever your university uses. and then Zoom. So like everyone's just on video conferencing calls, just like people in the workplace are. Everything's just done over video conferencing calls, and we have our online courses built in whatever LMS system your university uses. And those are the primary things. So all these like interesting niche, like cool ed tech products that are like designed to solve all these really specific problems aren't actually really being highly used. So in the same sense, the biggest thing that changed is really the scale in online learning, but all the tools that are primarily being used are basically everything that was being used beforehand.
So I'll give you an example in Clark County. So Las Vegas is in Clark County, which is this gigantic county. It's the size of New Jersey. It was partitioned up in the 1800s when there were like 1,000 people that lived here. So it's a geographically large county. Now it's got all the population in the state. So there's 2 million people. It's one school district. There's 300,000 students in the K through 12 system. And so when their system goes down, it's like a complete blackout of, you know, a decent sized Midwestern town getting completely underwater. So there were issues where, and, you know, it has the whole stretch of demographics too, in terms of people's access. There's a lot of, well, there are a variety of rural communities that are way out there that don't have quite the same infrastructure in place. But it was really, I guess, enlightening to see the scale of having 300,000 people all online all at the same time, and the hiccups that they had and had to deal with. It sorted itself out a bit as time went on, but it was basically just kind of what's the least amount that I can do to connect with to get face-to-face with my students, or at least bubble to bubble with my students, because a lot of students just had their cameras off the whole time.
Yeah, I think K-12 probably experienced a lot more differences because, you know, online education isn't typical in a K-12 environment. Whereas, I mean, higher education's been doing online learning for decades. You know, this is not necessarily new. It's really just that scale. So in higher ed, I mean, I took a couple online classes when I was in school. I don't love online classes. I like the social aspect of learning, you know, with the professor, with other students. But I think the change was really the disruption and like the massive scale, and universities not really being prepared for becoming a fully online institution in the matter of a week, especially at, you know, that spring 2020 semester where everything happened. Mm-hmm. So I think that was really the biggest change. And what it seems like from some of the data that we've looked at in my company, was it really was the rocky transition that caused a lot of problems for a lot of students rather than the online learning per se. You know, it is different, and not all students love online learning. A lot of people do. They like, you know, the flexibility that comes along with it, and it works for them. But there's still a significant chunk of students that are just like, I do not want to do online learning. So those students weren't having, you know, the best time in terms of their education, as we've seen, you know, especially for like community colleges and more broad access universities. A lot of them have experienced some major enrollment dips in the past year because a lot of students were just choosing not to enroll until things got back to normal. But it really does seem like the shift in the lack of infrastructure to support the scale at which online learning was happening was more of the problem than having classes online in themselves. You know, so
that was something that's actually an interesting point. So I looked through the data that you sent, and it looked like everyone's experience was basically centered on the negative side of the scale, except for the confidence in using online like technology materials going forward, and that was on the right hand side of the scale. So it's like, it was really bad. I didn't like this. I didn't like this. I didn't like this. But if it came down to it, I feel more comfortable learning some new system when it comes around.
Yeah, it really is a preference thing. Like some students just don't want to be online.
Yeah, it was. Was there a difference? Did you collect like major information, like what people were studying, or did you collect? And these were college students, right?
Yeah, so they're all college students. Primarily, about half the sample was from a primarily online institution already, which allowed us to compare, you know, kind of those experiences for students that are at an online institution when this happened versus those that are at like a 4-year public university. So most of the data, about half of it was from an online institution, half of it was from a 4-year public, just kind of regional university. And then we had 2 smaller schools, a private university and a community college. But the sample sizes from them were quite small. So you're really kind of comparing between online versus like a 4-year public kind of average university. It is interesting that you bring up the kind of their experiences. So one piece of data that didn't actually make it into the report, in a lot of my surveys, I like doing this kind of question where I ask them, I'm like, here's 3 boxes, give me 3 descriptors of your experience with online learning over the past years. I was just kind of curious of like, what did they think, how would they describe, their past year of learning? So we were specifically referencing the 2020 to 2021 school year. And so I took all those responses and kind of coded them for, positive versus negative kind of attribution of their experience, and then plotted them in terms of the frequency. And what's fascinating about the results is it is so evenly split. Like half of students are just like, I hate online learning. This is the worst thing that's ever happened to me. I do not want to do this again. And then the other half are like, this is great. It's flexible. I can fit it into my schedule. This is just a much better medium for me to go about my education. So we really just had this very 50-50 split, which I found really interesting because, we kind of hear in the higher ed space that online learning is like, the future of education, like education technology is going to change everything. And while that may be true, that's not for everyone. So I don't think, brick and mortar institutions and like this more traditional learning experience are going to go away anytime soon.
So a couple of questions that came up. One comment was that in-person classes is easier for professors and harder for students. I suppose it depends on what the motivations of the students are. If they're there for only learning, or if they're there, to learn and to meet people and for the social aspects. Because I think it's fair to say that the social aspects of the university life is an important component for many people.
Yeah, I would agree with that, and I would agree with the comment to a certain extent. So if I'm teaching, it depends also, if you're going to put on a really good class versus, a very mediocre class. But assuming we have an instructor that really wants to put effort and time into designing the best course possible, online learning can be more prep for the professor if they have to create content and have it recorded and, like set up kind of these different experiences and make sure that they're, managing and responding to everything. Whereas for the student, the design of online courses is supposed to be inherently flexible, so they can kind of watch things as they want and, attend class and do their work on their own schedule. Whereas for an in-person class, like it can be easier for professors because a lot of professors that I know kind of can wing it if you want, or like reuse materials in the classroom. My course this semester is a upper level course, so it's a discussion-based course. So while I still have a couple hours of prep that I have to do a week, the time that I'm actually spent in that classroom for that 3 hours is, really kind of engaging work for me while I'm in that space, because it's kind of unpredictable. I don't know what the students are going to bring up. Like I really try to drive a student-led discussion while having, kind of an outline and structure and making sure we're like hitting all those concepts. But online learning can be more work for the professor if it involves more prep time, whereas an in-person class is a little bit more acting in the moment, even if you're lecturing or discussing. So
was there anything that correlated with, did you collect data that correlated with whether people preferred the online versus the in-person? For example, I can imagine if you're a working student that being online is easier because then it removes commute time from things. It's easier so that alone is easy. But then like if you're at a desk and you just tell your boss, hey, from this hour to this hour, I'm going to be taking this class, a lot of certainly professional type things, I could imagine that going over okay, where then you don't have to move and that saves a fair amount of time. But was there a correlation between online versus in-person preference and any other kind of demographic information?
Yeah, I mean, a couple of things with that. Of course, the survey that we send out, it's an opt-in survey. So you're already getting kind of a selection bias of students that are just like, hey, I'll, spend time and fill out the survey. So, that's always something to keep in mind with pretty much any survey study. But, like I mentioned, we had students that self-selected into an online university and then students that self-selected into campus-based institutions. So of course, students that decide to go to an online university, they're going to, one, be more confident with how to use things because either they're, this is cross-sectional. So it can either be that they've learned how to use things because they've been in a fully online environment, or they already felt more comfortable self-regulating their learning and using technology. But as you mentioned, working students and more non-traditional students, so that typically tend to be older adults, not your traditional 18 to 22-year-old college student, do tend to prefer online learning because they can fit in their learning within their schedule. And there's whole universities that are set up for this. So Western Governors University, that my day job is affiliated with, was set up specifically to help adult learners, upskill and advance their career. So there is kind of this difference where non-traditional students are going to typically prefer online learning on average because it's more flexible. That's really the key piece with online learning, is that flexibility and that self-paced kind of nature that you can go about your learning in your own way.
Did you have you spoken with anyone who had an online class that was synchronous? So my online class was synchronous, so I had a lecture at a specific time of the day. And so aside from just setting up the computer, it wasn't vastly different than teaching. Well, okay, so in principle, it wasn't vastly different than teaching in person. In practice, it was a lot of sitting and a lot of talking into a computer screen. Was there any difference between asynchronous online teaching and synchronous online teaching from either your study or just the chatter?
Yeah, we didn't ask or differentiate between asynchronous and synchronous when we asked the students, just because we assumed that they would have a variety of classes that are kind of in different modalities. We are going to be surveying faculty this fall, and I definitely want to kind of get their experiences with EdTech and online learning and kind of these different environments. So hopefully I'll have some more data at the end of the year on at least faculty experience with teaching, but a little bit more anecdotally, I think one of the big lessons that we've learned about online teaching as things went online is that lecturing can, even though it's not inherently different with just a bunch of heads on a screen, it's not quite as effective or feels as effective as it does in person. One, because of kind of the slight delay in those social cues and kind of audio delay that occurs, where it's fine if it's just a couple people, but once you get, I don't know, maybe 100 people, it's hard to hold a interesting discussion with that many people online. And also just sitting in, a desk chair. I'm assuming a lot of students are just sitting in their beds most of the time during class. It's a little bit different. It's not quite the same experience as being in a classroom, and it's harder to facilitate breakout rooms and monitor what everyone's doing.
Yeah, no, that was something that I didn't have.
Cameras.
Breakout rooms wasn't anything I had to manage because it was basically just a straight lecture course. But one of the things for me is that, well, I get my exercise when I'm teaching in person. So I'm pacing back and forth. I'm, throwing my arms up in the air and describing things with great emphasis. And so being in an online environment where you're kind of constricted to, I need to stay in front of my iPad or else nothing's going to show up. It was certainly less engaging from my perspective because there wasn't a mechanism to really animate what I was doing. I will say that the students in general, because they were taking almost all their classes online, I got favorable reviews simply because I'd had some practice going into it. But anyways, it was certainly more enjoyable the other way. Was there anything new that, what was the situation with the mental health of students? And did that change with age or, like an elementary school kid staying home instead of going to school versus a 30-year-old who's staying at home instead of going to school? That's a bit of a spread in presumably the impact it would have on them.
Yeah, so I don't have that data from a specific, research study that I've done, but just from my own evaluation of kind of witnessing what's been going on in reading and, you know, my background in human development, I think I think online learning was probably far more negative for K-12 than it is for higher ed. Because for kids in K-12, social interactions are so fundamental for just their normal, typical development. They really need those social interactions, and kids get a lot of their social interactions these days through school, and through those activities, and, you know, working with their peers, and, you know, having recess, and just kind of all these kind of like spontaneous social interactions that occur throughout the day, I think are really, really important for children, for their social development, emotional development, figuring out how to solve problems and interact with people that aren't on a screen. Whereas for adults, I think it was less impactful for the majority, just because we typically have social networks outside of, you know, just, you know, your in-class education. And a lot of students, just especially typical age college students, are going to have larger social networks anyways. But to your point with age, that may change. We know that social networks tend to get smaller as people age over time. So they may not have as many outside, you know, social support. Some data that we had, though, again, I think it's really that transition piece to the online learning that seemed to cause the biggest problem. So one study that we've done, which we have some kind of preliminary analyses available on the Open Science Framework, but we haven't got the full analysis done yet. But what we found was we had an interesting opportunity with Western Governors University, because they've been online the whole time. So we could kind of see and, you know, kind of take away that impact of the rocky transition to online learning in the spring of 2020 to see if we actually saw a dip in academic performance as a result of the pandemic versus, you know, just typical years. Because most universities, you're going to have a massive confound of the weird transition to online learning. And what we found is, even for students, we have students at WGU have kind of a program mentor who they meet with once a week or once every other week to kind of just talk through their academic plan and study plan and help keep them on track. And those notes are, you know, coded in our database. So if like a COVID topic comes up of like, oh, someone's sick, or, you know, I'm sick, those are noted. So we were able to do an analysis that kind of pulled out students that have mentioned COVID versus those who haven't, and see if they had any difference in terms of their academic performance. And we found that students that were experiencing COVID issues got more support from the university in terms of their program mentor, more meetings with them and helping them through. And we actually saw like no dip in academic output across those early months of the pandemic in spring, when universities were like, we have to switch to pass fail grade systems, and, you know, everything is just, you know, a mess in higher ed. So again, it's really that transition, whereas we saw very little impact on typical academic output at our university because we were already fully online and there was no rocky transition. And those that needed that extra support were getting that extra support from the staff at the university. So it was an interesting little case study of
Did the teachers at Western Governors University change what they did at all? Like, were they, because they're already kind of online, now we can add some new stuff? Or were they like, we're already doing this, so the status quo is sufficient for our purposes?
Yeah, they did change some of like their support, like with the kind of adding like tags into their notes programs and things for COVID, specifically monitoring how, you know, students are doing a little bit more closely as a result of that, adding in some extra supports. But in terms of like the learning environment stayed the same, whereas it was more so just an addition of those academic supports to help students go through as they're dealing with kind of these outside sources of stress as a result of the pandemic. But like I said, the online learning didn't seem to be the issue. It was just the rocky transition that most universities had. And then most of them aren't set up to have fully scaled online learning. There's only, you know, a few universities that do that really, really well. So that was really the big problem.
Yeah, there were a number of professors who just went straight to Twitch. My very first class, I just did it on my Twitch stream. In the second year, I didn't do it on the Twitch stream because as much as I like the chat and the people that tune in on Twitch, there's always the issue of like there's students who are paying for it, and then there's other people, and I just wanted to separate it a little bit more so that I didn't go off on too many tangents in the limited time that I had available. I could focus. Is there when it comes to, so let's switch gears a little bit and go towards what is the third organization you have, the third hat you have. So we did the teaching in person at Utah Valley University, which is the largest university now in the state of Utah. Then you have the online learning, and then your third hat, what is this?
So my third hat is communications for the Human Behavior and Evolution Society. So we're an academic organization that it's primarily psychologists along with anthropologists and biologists that are all focused on trying to understand human behavior from an evolutionary perspective. So we had, a fun experience. This is actually a really positive, kind of virtual experience. So with our society, we usually have our conference, our in-person conference in the summer, typically in June, which obviously we canceled at the, kind of last minute because of the pandemic, and Detroit was it was supposed to be in Detroit last year. So no one was having that. And so we actually had our first fully virtual conference over the summer, which I was put on the organizing committee for that. So I had a academic conference that I was planning, and I was part of the host committee for that.
How many members of this society? How big is it?
We typically have about 400 to 500, and our membership actually grew by, I think, almost 200 people this past summer just from having the virtual conference, because everyone wanted to join, because now everyone can join. We are an international society, so we do actually, unlike some societies that are like, we're international and it's just 95% people from the US, we actually do have a sizable chunk of our membership across Europe and South America and Asia, and Australia as well. So we actually were able to grow our impact this year because we were fully virtual. I mean, we got a lot of really great feedback. We use a newer platform, so I'll give them a little plug, OYA, which some professors I know have started using it for their online classes. And it was an absolutely awesome platform. Like most conferences that I've been to have been using, at least at the beginning, we're using some form of like Zoom, basically for meetings, which, wasn't quite what we wanted to do.
Like 10 people, 30 people, but 300 people is...
You're basically just logging onto meetings all day, which isn't quite a conference-y type of experience, because why do people go to conferences? It's for the social experience. So I just go to conferences for the social experience, a little bit more than sharing. But we use the OEA platform, which is highly customizable. So we had like a bunch of Darwin themed, like rooms for people to hang out in. It had emoji reactions. So when we had like the plenary speakers going, which we did have them go live, people were able to react, with different emojis. So it was very interactive. Whereas on Zoom, you can have your little like reaction show up in the screen, but it's not quite as, interactive.
So with this,
really fun.
Did you have, so when this conference was happening, what did these rooms look like, the virtual rooms? Because a lot of times in, like we had a conference that was supposed to be in Germany and it ended up going online, and there really wasn't a whole lot of interaction at all in those kinds of side rooms.
Yeah, so we had a few main stages where all like the main talks would happen. So you'd have the speaker, they kind of have their little box, and then we had all the regular speakers record their talks, which also was a huge problem solver for the notorious people that don't adhere to time limits on academic talks. So everyone had to stay to 15 minutes and we knew you could because you had to record it. So we had different themes. So we had like our main stage, it was set up as a very like traditional auditorium. So like the whole background, had the, red velvet curtains on like the big stage where the talk was. There was a chat box and a list of participants so you could see everyone that was there. And there'd be an online chat box, just like kind of your Twitch stream is right now, where people can, have their own little side conversations. We had a little speaker panel or a question panel. So when someone wanted to ask questions, they could drag their avatar into the little box and show up on the screen so you could actually see the person asking the question. And like I said, we had a bunch of different little emojis at the bottom. So like there's like, the little clapping one, it made clapping noises. So people could interact. And, when some technical snafu, people are laughing, and we had, our custom little Darwin emojis pop up. And so it was really, really cool. It was way better than a Zoom meeting. So you could fully customize. We had a beach room, so some of the talks were on the beach. We had another room that was like mountain themed, and then we had about 20 different social rooms, which were all kind of like puns of, like evolutionary theory and Darwin. So there's, like some bars. So, the classic conference bar, it was set up as a bar, and you can drag your avatars around to different chairs. There's puzzles that you could put together. There's karaoke rooms. So we really tried,
Well, with like people actually singing and stuff like that.
Yeah. So we had photo booth rooms where you could drag your avatar to things. So Corinne Apicella and Chris Von Ruden, who were also on the host committee, really designed the whole space really, really well. And our members loved it. They're like, can you keep, incorporating some of these things? So that was probably the most positive, pandemic experience that I've had in terms of, professional things moving online. It went really, really well. So everything was open access, all of our talks. If you go to Open Science Framework and search in the OSF meetings and search for HBEST 2021, you can find all of the talks and recordings.
So with that experience, what is the plan for next year?
Yeah, so next year we're planning for in-person as of now in Detroit at the Rensen downtown, which is a gorgeous location. So I grew up in Metro Detroit, so I'm really excited to go back and be in person. But it's interesting, and so this is an interesting problem that's been coming up, that for professional events and conferences and for classes is it's almost easier to do fully in person or fully remote than this hybrid. And so, we're moving back to fully in person for HBEST 2022 in Detroit. How to do that hybrid is a really hard question, because apparently the costs for live streaming rooms and having kind of this
you have to pay for the
interactive space.
Yeah, you have to pay for all the IT stuff, and that's like tens of thousands of dollars.
Yeah, so it's interesting that doing something hybrid, let's have recorded talks and not everyone has to fly in, because especially for graduate students that are in a different country, it's really expensive, to fly over to the United States. We do our conference internationally every 3 or 4 years or so, but a lot more students were able to attend this year because you just have to pay your membership fee and log on. So we're trying to figure out what kind of aspects of the open virtual experience we can carry over. But it is honestly more expensive to do a hybrid conference than it is to do fully online or fully in person, which presents a challenge. And I think this has been a broader discussion in academia this past year of the accessibility benefits and the cost benefits and the climate benefits of being fully online. And people are, there's kind of this debate going on of we should just nix all academic conferences and everything should be online.
So I've thought about that, and I'm expecting to get some pushback because I'm organizing a conference this coming summer as well. Well, it's going to be late spring because you don't want to come to Las Vegas for a conference in the summer. So it'll be May. Conference hosted here in Las Vegas, and it's going to be in person. As far as I can tell, it's going to be in person. That's the plan. We've committed to the hotel. It will be the AAS, the American Astronomical Society, is helping with the logistics, and their first in-person meeting is going to be the one in Salt Lake City in January, and so this will be their second in-person meeting. And there are a lot of a lot of things that go into making a conference. One of the things is that it's not free to put a conference together. And so I can imagine, I'm imagining now getting feedback from people about, how come we didn't do all this online? Aren't we ruining the world by, flying people around? And so my response to that is, if you're going to spend the money, then it's going to have basically the same carbon footprint. So if you have a grant and you're going to take your travel money and not use it for travel, and you're going to put it to something else instead, that money is going to ultimately be spent on energy. Eventually, it will make its way down to somebody paying bills, someone doing this, someone doing that, and the energy comes from right now the primarily fossil fuels. And so unless you're going to take the money that you would have spent on the conference and stuff a pillow with it, your carbon footprint is basically going to be the same, one way or the other.
Should write an op-ed on this and and see how people are responding. But
Uh-huh.
yeah, I generally I think you make a good point on that because we're just using the money and just putting it somewhere else instead. We're not cutting those costs fully, but
Because like and it's not that the conference itself. I can imagine that a conference itself is going to be have a smaller carbon footprint, but it's the money that would have gone to the conference that is then going to get spent on something else, even if it's spent on, like in my discipline, if it's spent on computer modeling. So we're going to buy more hours on a computer cluster, and we're going to do a simulation of planet formation on this thing, and it's going to be 5 million hours of computer time. Well, okay, so you pay for those 5 million hours of computer time, and the carbon footprint of providing electricity and cooling the building and paying the staff and all that kind of stuff, it's basically the same.
Yeah. I'm curious of how much kind of what the impact has been over the past year or two with faculty and professionals having to buy so much more tech, and the impact of producing all that tech to be able to have more of a fully online environment. Because even for myself, like I've had to buy like better microphones and headphones and screens and all this stuff so I can have, a full home office setup, for example, rather than using the overhead somewhere else. And then of course, like my home bills have been much higher too, because I'm at home all day rather than leaving. So my own electricity bill and things like that have increased since I've been working from home pretty much full time. But, I think, again, it's the same problem or the same urge for us to have in-person conferences is the same urge that we have for in-person classes, is the social experience. Like, we learn socially, we want to interact with people socially, and the online virtual space can substitute a lot of that, but it doesn't quite fulfill.
Yeah, I don't think it's the same. Yeah, I think for some people, I might be fine locking myself in a closet for a long time, but I know, I've seen just the response of people, my friends and colleagues and stuff like that, where they really do. The social aspect, like interacting with people, is an important part of their life. Like, it's where they get a lot of their own personal well-being comes from those kinds of interactions. And I've been to a few online conferences, and to be honest, when I've attended these online conferences, it's like, oh, this talk's interesting. You pick and choose a little bit more, and as a consequence, you're not always exposed to things that are a bit outside of your wheelhouse that you would have otherwise been a part of. And it's also way harder I think that while the delivery of the current science probably isn't affected that much, the development of new ideas for future science, I think, is significantly impacted in a negative direction by only having online stuff.
Yeah, I think with the online only, like, you have to schedule interactions with people. You have to set up an email. It's like, hey, can you talk? So online social interactions, with one or two people, it's pretty fine. Like, I think the conversation that you and I are having right now isn't dramatically different than it would be if we were sitting in person, for example. Is it's just the two of us. But in larger social spaces, like at conferences, like, all the best ideas happen out in the hallway, like outside of the talks, where we're just talking. You can't replicate that spontaneity of social interactions that occur in the classroom, in a conference, in an office space. So you do lose that piece. And I think it's a really, really fundamentally important piece. But on the other side of that argument with the fully virtual conferences, there's a lot more benefits, or at least there's a large number of benefits. It's like, how do you where's that trade-off balance? Because online, one, you have greater accessibility for everyone around the world. So you can include more people, which that may, contribute to the generation of new ideas. You can make the science itself more accessible. Like, for our HBES conference, all of our talks were online. We've never had that before. So in a way, we're having a greater impact because all of the knowledge that, was presented at that conference is fully available for anyone to access, which, is really cool. No one's been there. No one's done that before. And it is, a generally more inclusive space of, you don't have the inhibitory costs of flights for graduate students, or, physical accessibility for individuals that are, have disabilities. They may not be able to fully participate in the full in-person space, whereas they do for an online space. You can have closed captioning, which, because we are an international society, all of our conferences are held in English, but we have a lot of students and professionals that English is their second language, and good for them because I can't speak another language and I hate it every time I travel outside of the United States. I feel very bad about myself that I have not worked harder to speak another language. But because of all the closed captioning and the recorded talks, we heard from so many of our colleagues that don't speak English as their first language. Or like, I was able to participate more because I can participate in a chat and actually have time to read and understand what people are saying, read the closed captioning, which has been really helpful. So, on the one hand, you're losing that spontaneity of ideas, but on the other hand, you're including more people and more diverse people in those spaces. So that,
so
how does that balance?
Right. And also, does that actually bring up a dichotomy in that some conferences may be designed for certain things, more like a symposium, as opposed to like a workshop type thing?
Yeah.
So there was a question someone asked about, can they get links to where can one find links to this conference?
Actually, let me find it. Here we go. I will drop that in the chat right now. Just make sure it's the right one. So we used OSF the Open Science Framework, to host everything. So let me put that in here right now. Hopefully, there we go. I have to. I don't have a Twitch account. Jason, let me send it to you.
Okay.
And then you can add it send it in our chat.
So along these lines, what in that discipline of okay, let me get this. There we go.
Link incoming.
Okay, so it's on a separate computer. So here we go. This is what I'm going to do. So the link will appear in the chat. In the meantime, what is what's new in that discipline? Like what's been some new results coming from that discipline?
I think it's going to be a broad kind of piece, but what I found most interesting about kind of the evolution of human behavior space is evolution of human behavior, and even HBAS has primarily been psychologists. And in the evolutionary psychology space, a lot of our work focuses on human mating, so most of it has to do with, our sexual psychology and behavior. And I think the disciplines just become a lot more diverse and truly interdisciplinary. So we've been using a lot of different methods. So we have a lot of influence from anthropology and demography and biology and computational biology coming in, and genetics as well. And I think what's been most interesting is watching some of these like very generalized kind of conclusions about human behavior starting to actually be overturned with a lot more nuance involved in them. So I call it, evolutionary psychology specifically is a newer discipline within, it was kind of really formalized in the 80s.
So that means because Jonathan Haidt, isn't he a evolutionary? Who are examples of evolutionary psychologists that people would recognize?
So the two founders of the discipline who really conceptualized, the framework that most of evolutionary psychology is built on is Leda Cosmides and John Tooby. So they both work at UCSB and they have their whole center. John Tooby is an anthropologist. Leda is a psychologist. So they really outlined, the core framework in their work. And then we have David Buss is probably the most popular. He just actually had a new book come out. He's written many popular books. So his recent one is When Men Behave Badly, and it's all understanding sexual assault from, an evolutionary perspective, primarily focusing on male to female sexual behavior. And so he's probably one of the bigger faces in that area. But some other interesting individuals that have been coming out, Leif Al-Shawaf, he's at University of Colorado Springs. He writes a lot of popular essays on what is evolutionary psychology and trying to overcome some of these misperceptions and these broad generalizations that men are oriented to short-term mating and women are oriented to long-term mating, and that's why there's a conflict. all of these kind of like old school evolutionary findings are like a yes, but
Uh-huh.
there's the big but that is coming in after. And I think a lot of work is really starting to show all the nuance in these generalizations, because EP does have kind of like a PR problem. Evolutionary psych has a little bit of a PR problem where it gets picked up by some like very rogue online internet communities, and kind of just taken it's this really black and white male female like battle, which I firmly believe that there are very basic sex differences between males and females in terms of how we develop, the adaptive problems we face over evolutionary history, interacting with culture and society. But it's much more interesting than this like male and female like hard dichotomy that
well, it's kind of it's the difference between like where do the means land and where do the distributions land.
Exactly.
So you're
all that interesting
you're going to you're spreading things apart and looking at the overlap and then trying to understand, like, I guess one question would be like, why are we so similar? Is a similar, along those same lines. So what is it that's driven the overturning of the historical perspective?
I mean, I think one is just we're having more people interested. So any new discipline, is going to be, a small community when these things start, because it's truly interdisciplinary. Most graduate programs, one of the main reasons I went to the graduate program I did is because we had a concentration, with evolutionary psychology specifically, which most graduate programs don't. But now that it's gotten bigger, the field's gotten bigger. One, there's more attention on it. So people are like, there's more interesting things about evolution and human behavior than like this male female sexual dichotomy, which is obviously important and the focus of a lot of my academic research, but there's so much more to human behavior than just male female romantic relations. And so I think having just a larger community, more people with more varied interests, has had an impact. And then just more advanced methods in terms of research and what we've been learning about behavioral genetics, what we've been learning about just biology in general, demography, better cross-cultural research contributions from anthropology. So just, as the field becomes bigger, there's more people, more ideas, and more conversation to kind of work through some of these problems.
How does one craft study to answer a scientific question in that discipline? Is it like, because like, do you go into the fossil record and look at these things, or is it more contemporary where you can actually get new data? How do you formulate a question, and then what are the things that you do to answer that question, as opposed to like in physics where you pose a question, you build an inanimate object to...
Yeah, I mean, on the one hand, evolutionary psychology and specifically with psychology uses the same methods as other psychologists do. We do surveys, we do lab experiments. It's really about how you're actually specifying your question of, if we, are proposing this specific type of mechanism, or a better way to put that is, what type of information is our brain looking for? So for example, one area that's kind of been overturned, or kind of new data has provided nuance. So what female waist to hip ratio indicates, so the proportion of, a waist circumference to your hip circumference, that was initially proposed originally like to indicate fertility. So women with like this idealized type 0.7 waist to hip ratio are more fertile. And therefore that's why men find it attractive. So you can kind of see this waist size represented in like cartoons, and, obviously very popular celebrities and models, typically have this particular type of waist size. And it was proposed that because, in surveys, you propose, have a bunch of different avatars with different size waist to hip ratios, you see what men cross-culturally find most attractive. They all narrow in on this kind of area. And then with psychology, there's a lot of inference that goes into the data in a little bit more ways than I think physics does. And so it was just proposed that it's like, oh, more fertile, these women tend to be younger, more physically attractive, therefore it must be indicating fertility. So there's a large body of work on waist to hip ratio. And what's actually coming out is that the waist-hip ratio doesn't necessarily indicate fertility, it indicates age. So younger women tend to have a smaller waist-hip ratio for a variety of reasons. It indicates age, and it indicates that you probably haven't had a child before, which for humans who are long-term maters, typically
successfully having a child is...
You don't want a woman that have already had a child with another person before. So it's really indicated. It's just like those little bit of nuances. Yeah, age is correlated with fertility, but what our minds are actually picking up on are just age and have you had a child before. So it's just those little bits of nuance. But we use surveys, meta-analysis, and then because we bring
that's actually a simpler, I guess, piece of data to glean. Instead of fertility, which is a more complex physiological thing, to just be like, here's how old this person is, roughly speaking, based upon where they are in their development.
Yeah, and that's a pretty good proxy for
everything else. That actually even makes more sense. Not that I think about this all the time, but that makes more sense because it's a more straightforward piece of information.
Yeah, I mean, it seems like the idea that we can pick up on like kind of this genetic status or fertility status seems to be going away as well. So another popular hypothesis that was proposed, I forgot exactly, probably around the 90s time, was this dual mating hypothesis for women. So basically it was trying to explain, like, why do women cheat on their partners? For men, it's a little bit more straightforward. If men cheat on their partners and sleep with someone else, they can potentially have more offspring. Like, it's pretty straightforward. Like, men's mating psychology is less like, it's more straightforward in terms of your behavior can directly increase your reproductive output, because men don't have to go through the we
don't have to bear children, we don't have to
you don't have to do all that work. So it's you
don't have to worry about septicemia in the Austrian hospitals and things like that.
Yeah, if men have more partners, they can kind of linearly increase their reproductive output along with the number of partners that they have. Women, you're constrained by the fact that you can only have, one pregnancy every 9 to 12 months, and at best, if you really turn things around quickly. But so one of the ideas was, well, why do women cheat on their partners? And the original hypothesis was that women around ovulation are more attracted to these CAD. So it's kind of this CAD versus DAD idea of these like promiscuous, very attractive, burly men kind of idea. So during peak ovulation, they would be more attracted to like more manly men rather than
so I think I remember seeing something like this where they look at like the facial features throughout the month and see.
Yeah, so there's been a ton of research on like women across their menstrual cycle and what different features of men they find attractive. And it was proposed, some early studies suggested that women are attracted to more, kind of masculine features, which are typically associated with a more promiscuous mating strategy. And therefore, women cheat on their partners to try to get the good genes from the macho man affair partner, and then like trick the, investing, loving partner into like raising that kid. So you get the best of both worlds. So this was going on for a while. And there's been a lot of really good replication studies of kind of these menstrual cycle effects. This is a very robust area of research now. It's hard data to collect, and women self-reporting their menstrual cycle can have a lot of variability in there. But basically what they found is that women aren't necessarily attracted to more masculine features. They typically just tend to have a higher sexual interest around ovulation as compared to other points in the menstrual cycle. And that women, some interesting data that's come out too, is that women are looking when women rate kind of their affair partners or the attractiveness of affair partners, they tend to look for similar traits as they look for in long-term mates. So that doesn't really make any sense if you're just trying to like get good genetic material from a man. So David Buss has actually come up with this mate switching hypothesis. So women tend to, as he puts it nicely, have back burner mates. So if their usually women, if they have an affair, they are more likely to actually fall in love with their affair partner than men are. Women are more likely to have affairs when they're unsatisfied in their relationship, whereas men, they're more likely to have affairs if the opportunity presents itself, and their marital satisfaction actually doesn't predict whether they're going to have affairs, which is somewhat disconcerting sometimes. But the idea that women kind of were trying to get the best of both worlds from these like dads versus cads has really fallen out of favor, and evidence doesn't support that. Women, when they fall or they decide to, peruse outside of the relationship, tend to be looking for men that they want to have a long-term relationship with. And sometimes it's a useful mechanism to switch out of those relationships. So again, not as, kind of sexy as the original findings were, but this is what better data.
Well, yeah. And it kind of indicates that also would, is basically the idea is that you have, here's your life, and if you want to have a partner throughout your life, then it's best to have something lined up that you can, to have a relatively smooth transition into person number two. So there were some comments that came up, questions about families, and how, and like having, kind of nuclear families as the societal structure. Personally, I'm a big fan of families. I think that they tend to, I think the data are, from what I've read, I don't keep up with the literature, but I will say that what I've read historically has pointed in the direction of families are actually good for kids. And it's fairly clear, the differences. But what is the current status of the family? How does the family rate in the evolutionary psychology literature?
I love this topic. This is one of my favorite topics to lecture about, because I think mating systems and family systems are really, really interesting. So you are right. In our modern setup society, nuclear families are associated with the best outcomes. So when we say nuclear family, we say, like two parents and, 2.5 kids in a household together. So yes, in our modern society, how things are constructed, that is typically associated with the best outcomes for kids. But here's where the big but comes in. The nuclear family is not the ancestral type of family living arrangement that humans have been living in, that's natural. Doesn't mean it's good. Like natural doesn't mean good all the time, but our nuclear family is very weird. It's a very kind of modern invention. Because of how society is set up and because of the different opportunities that we now have. I don't live by any of my family anymore. That is very unusual,
historically speaking.
Yeah, think before civilization, 10,000+ years ago, me living, 2,000 miles away or whatever it is from my family is a very odd situation. Like that wouldn't occur.
Let me. Yeah. Okay, so an alternative would be a family structure where it's like me and my kids and my spouse and my brother lives not far away, and then my grandparents are just around the corner, and so like it's a localized family complex, maybe is the way to describe it. Is that recognized as distinct from a nuclear family in the literature?
Yeah, typically when we think of nuclear family, we think of kind of these isolated household units, because that's typically what people do now. You grow up, you move out of your parents' house, you find a partner, you get your own place. So what you were just describing, where, your family's close by, grandparents are close by, aunts and uncles, you have, your other social network of close friends, you all hang out together, your friends or your grandparents, can help raise the children with you. So alloparenting is very common in our evolutionary history, where particularly female family members and other really close family friends would help raise children. So kind of what you think of as like neighborhood kind of daycare, idea, a certain block, someone has daycare and like all the kids kind of hang out and, someone helps, rear the children during the day. Those kind of situations are more similar to our ancestral family environments. It was very interconnected. It was, very intergenerational. Whereas that intergenerational aspect, I think we're really starting to lose in modern societies, especially as the age at which people are having children continues to increase. You're separating out that knowledge base.
Yeah. So at that point, your grandparents are 70 instead of 40.
Yeah, I mean, I'm turning 30 this year, and all my grandparents are gone, and I still don't have children yet. So like all those grandparents aren't there, which
Hmm.
this again would be an unusual situation in an ancestral environment. What does seem to be kind of like the mechanism is having multiple somewhat related devoted adults across different generations, along with mixed age larger peer groups, which we're also seeing decrease as people are only having one, maybe two kids. So we're seeing a lot, like the two parents 2.5 kids in their own house is just not the typical environment. It used to be much more intergenerational,
Hmm.
much more
Yeah, so
mixed,
this is
kind of blended with people around.
that's an interesting point. So I guess my perspective would be that in the environment that we live in, where people are living away from their family, that the nuclear family is kind of the most fundamental unit that you can get to behave like with the highest probability of functional relationships coming out of it. Um, the but I would say that that probably is not, because I remember when I lived in Chicago, I missed being able to have my kids interact with their cousins and things like that. I recognized that that was something that they were missing. And in I did this study. I mention this all the time when I give talks to religious organizations. That not on astronomy, which I kind of split my time sometimes between astronomy and then just general topics. But one of the things is, I think I shared it with you last time we spoke, this study that came, it was reported in the New York Times, but it was a study, part of it was done in the military, but it was some people in New Jersey, I believe, who were asking questions around 9/11. It was before 9/11. They were asking questions about, students' mental health and how they dealt with stress and what, how they felt about life in general, before, and then 9/11 happened, and they went back to the same students after 9/11 and asked kind of the same questions. And one of the findings, and I can send this to you if perhaps I'm misremembering, one of the findings that they had was that the students who did best at dealing with new stresses, even if they weren't directly impacted by 9/11, they could tell that their parents were stressed out. The ones that did the best were the ones who felt like they were part of a larger family narrative. That if they knew even simple things like where their parents were born, where their grandparents, like what their grandparents' names are, where their grandparents are from, any kind of family history, like my great uncle was a train robber 150 years ago. They didn't all have to be positive stories. They could be positive and negative stories. But just the existence of here's how kind of my place in the universe was something that gave an added level of resilience in the presence of these kinds of stresses.
Yeah, I mean, we humans are an intensely cooperative social species. So we want to build those social networks. We want to build those like extended family units. We have evolved in an environment where we have a very large enough, not as large as cities and things are today, but a large interconnected intergenerational mixed age group social community. So not being in environments, I think that has, a lot of implications in our modern society of, people upend and move around all the time. There's a lot more transience to our social networks as we grow up and get new jobs and focus on careers and all these things, and not having that core social community, which family has historically played a big part in. Religious communities play a huge part in this, and one of the key psychological reasons why religious communities are so important and we see the positive effects of them is because of that strong social network that goes along with it. And even if we want to circle back to higher education, that's why student belonging is one of the key things that universities are focusing on, and one of the key challenges online, as we've been talking about, are those social connections. So our psychology is set up in a very social way. So once we have these kind of, quote unquote, weird environments like we have in the Western countries like the United States, where we have these nuclear family units, everything can be done online. you don't have to interact with humans if you don't want to for days on end and still get everything from clicking on your phone. It is convenient because we're also pretty inherently lazy as well. So we get drawn to these very lazy solutions, but they can have some negative effects down the road. And having those strong social networks can really act as a buffer to big life stressor events, as you were just mentioning with that study. So the social networks are just really important.
Yeah. So how that pertained to the military was they examined, instead of having everyone go through the same struggles, like they come into this thing and then we yell at them and then they all feel bad about themselves and they build themselves up as a unit together. What they would do is when they would put into some unit, some mountain division or something like that, then they would be given a kind of a history of that unit. Like, here's how you fit into the history of this pre-existing unit, so that you're kind of a part of a thread that goes through, in World War II, this unit landed on this beach and did this thing. And then in Korea, this thing happened and this unit saved this person from the mountaintop at the chosen lake that was freezing cold. And so that was a way of establishing unit cohesion, because it was a way of binding people to a common narrative that they wouldn't necessarily have gotten if they were just thrown into a mix and then shaken up a little bit and said, okay, now you're a family, or like now you're be a cohesive unit. Congratulations.
Yeah, and interesting how you mentioned the importance of kind of those family ties. What the military also does, and other organizations do this as well, is use kin terminology. So there was this really interesting paper a few years back in the journal Evolution and Human Behavior, which is the main journal for the Human Behavior and Evolution Society. They did this whole analysis of how different cultures use kin terminology. So like in the United States, typically like your parents, siblings, or your aunts and uncles. Some cultures have a broader definition of what's an aunt or an uncle. Other cultures have more, specific terminology for like, your mother's siblings versus your father's siblings. But the point of kind of this analysis was showing that organizations like the military borrow kin terminology, like brothers, for example, to try to help, build that family, kind of to use that psychology of our family and those social groups to form, that closer social connection. So just how you were saying, the history of the family group within the military and that, that unit, and then using kind of this kin terminology that our psychology is already going to process in a very specific way, all contributes to that, like group cohesion that you were mentioning. So it just kind of goes to the importance of the family networks and those broader social groups overall. So
what, is there anything new that's come out in terms of, I remember exactly. Okay, so we got into this by asking, what is the role of the nuclear family, and how does okay, when we're talking about these things, are there other options that are presented in the research? So you're doing a research on this. Are those the only two options that people investigate, or what are the other comparison family structures, I guess, that go into these kinds of studies? And what are the most common things that people are also looking for in these kinds of studies?
Yeah, I think it's going to depend on where you are in the world. And so psychology studies are kind of like policy research that comes out, which focuses a lot on family policy research. So they're going to really look at like single-headed households. So just with like a single parent, they typically define a family as who's ever in the household, the physical household. So in the United States, you're going to see, like single mother, father household, sometimes analyzing whether kids are living with grandparents as like kind of their primary guardian, as opposed to their parent. Whereas if you go elsewhere in the world, especially if you're taking more of an anthropological perspective, you're going to be a little bit more descriptive in kind of what those family units look like. And one area that my research had intersected with was the impact of fathers specifically. So this is, a really big kind of research area in the United States with the increase in single mother households and, decreasing marriage rates and, kind of this whole impact with fathers not being in the household as much. And so there's some really interesting research cross-culturally, because in the modern West, fathers, and more specifically two parents, are really, really important for child development. You have, more efficient use of your resources, greater overall resources, which correlates to where you can live, which correlates with your school system, which correlates with life outcomes. So, it all gets roped in. But in the US, it makes sense to frame it as kind of like a father crisis of, missing fathers in households. But cross-culturally, that framing doesn't really make a lot of sense, because father investment cross-culturally isn't always, it's not a default. So there's a lot of societies where paternal investment is by default very low. And within their society, those children with, kind of missing fathers in those households aren't losing out.
So like Mary Poppins, the Victorian era thing where Mr. Banks would come home and children were supposed to be seen but not heard.
Yeah. So when we, the father framing makes sense because we have a society built around a nuclear family. When you go cross-culturally, paternal investment cross-culturally is very dependent on the economic situations, the cultural situation. So it's not the default. The variation of paternal investment in humans is very, very wide. But in those societies where like fathers are noticeably absent or like don't invest, what they also have is strong alloparenting aspects. So it's not just a single mother in a house. There's a whole community of women and extended family that collectively help rear the children. So again, what I was
that would also mean in those kinds of societies, if you have multiple kind of adult figures, that you would also span a wider variety of the personality distribution. So you would get advice from the grumpy aunt and from the flower child aunt.
You have more exposure to different thoughts and knowledge bases that that's kind of the point of childhood, is to learn as much as you can from different people. So in societies where paternal investment is typically low and it's not seen as it's not a bad thing, it's not framed as a bad thing, that's just what their cultural evolution has looked like, those societies tend to also have greater what we call allo-parenting networks of the extended family and friends and strong communities of women that help raise children. So it makes sense in the West for that to be a society problem, but we're built around a nuclear family and that's what's typical. And because two parents in a household, two adult figures in a household are correlated with income, which is correlated with neighborhood, which is correlated with school systems, you see kind of those downstream impacts. And that would be on the economic side, but I suspect that it's also beneficial on the psychological side as well. So I gave a talk at a church a few years ago on Father's Day, and I brought out some of the things, these are things that Barack Obama mentioned, and also that, is it Warren Farrell, that wrote The Boy Crisis? So there's a book called The Boy Crisis where he kind of goes into depth about, here's what happens when there's lack of fathers, is correlated with a variety of social ills, and both for young men and for young women, but it affects men and women differently, the lack of a father. But that's so going into those kinds of details, do you think our society today, when there are fewer father figures, I guess so just addressing the society that we live in where the nuclear family is kind of expected, what would be the thing that would help create more tightly knit nuclear families? Like, what would bring the fathers back into the family? What kinds of things would help? That's a big question.
Aside maybe from restructuring the welfare system.
Yeah, I think, that has, significant impact as well. I think one thing, this is kind of a little deviation around your question, but gets to the point again of those social networks. So what we find are helpful interventions for kids that don't have fathers are being part of these, this is why like Big Brother, Big Sister exists. So you can have, those
mentors.
Those mentors. You actually, again, it's that social modeling, because what do kids that typically don't have fathers in the household, Typically, if it's a single-headed household, that single parent is typically working full-time to support the children. So it's, lack of a father is one thing, but you just don't have a strong family environment if you're a kid in a single-headed household with a full-time working parent. So what kids usually do is they try to replace that social network, and peers have an outsized kind of influence on those individuals, and they may get in, not the best peer groups that may exist in some areas. But that's why like these after school programs are really important for children that may not have kind of that stronger, stable family environment, having those adult mentors. So it's not,
so like the
question,
adult mentor. Well, that makes sense. So adult mentors, if you're turning to peers, then in many regards, because peer pressure is a real thing, in many regards, you're going to end up doing the stupidest thing that people come up with, instead of. So I guess having kind of a cross-generational mentorship relationship can bring in the experience of, no, because when I was your age, I did the same stupid thing, and so let's avoid that.
Yeah.
Otherwise, you keep making the same. You can imagine keep making the same mistakes over and over again.
I mean, you have someone to rein it in when especially teenagers. Peers are enormously important for social development. You need to be able to you don't want to be so protected that you don't mess up and do stupid things.
So that's definitely what Jonathan Haidt is saying. Like, it's good to go to a playground where you can get hurt if you try.
Yeah, basically you learn your limits. Our brains are meant to take in information and construct, our boundaries and our risk assessments. Without that input, you end up with like highly anxious children that are scared to do things. And that's not good either. So, again, it's in that middle area. So, teenagers are notoriously, with the way our brains develop, they over-perceive the benefits and, aren't fully seeing the costs. There's, the way that our brains develop cause this very real observation that teenagers just do stupid things and don't understand how risky they really are until they look back like later, and you're just like, oh, like, why did I do that? So having parents that are like, you'll understand when you're my age, and like, I know better, it is helpful to rein back, or at least give some perspective of like, okay, I have all these adults telling me that what I want to do is really dumb, or what I did was really dumb. At least you have that input and that information. Whereas if you don't have any strong adults around you and you're just surrounded by a bunch of other peers, you're gonna, like you said, end up doing the stupidest thing possible. So I think, the problem of single parent households isn't necessarily the problem of just like one parent per se, but it's just all the other correlates that go along with it. You're more likely to be in neighborhoods that also have more single parent households, that's correlated with, certain income, which correlates, with your schooling and the types of peers that you may be.
So, well, like people that earn, people that are in a similar situation in their family structure are going to end up with a similar economic situation. There's going to be a distribution, but the distribution is going to be in some part of a larger distribution. And that is going to correlate with where you can buy a home.
Which correlates with
everything else that goes along with it
in the area, and everything else that we measure in society as outcomes. So it's not just putting two parents in a house isn't going to fix something per se, but it definitely can help. Well,
it can certainly fix some things, or like ameliorate some things, which then can dampen the ill effects that might come from other things. I mean, it's not like just because someone's in a two-parent home doesn't mean that they can't also have problems, right? I mean, how many children of very wealthy people are strung out? Right.
Again, little oversight. Kind of, I feel like same lack of oversight and way too many resources to get into. Very weird activities. So different problems, but same kind of context in a way.
So, any last comments that you want to bring out in this discussion?
I think we really went the whole circle around a couple of times. So I feel like this was a great discussion, and I was very pleased to have all my hats kind of weave together. So
I'm always happy to talk about family stuff, because it's something that I really certainly value my own family relationships. I know, for example, I have a number of sisters, and one of them actually just moved next door to another one of my sisters, in kind of the ancestral homeland of where at least in the United States, where the Stefan clan emerged. So, a portion of us came from Germany and England, and then went to this place in northern Utah. And now I have, I drive by where my grandparents were, and I see the home. It's owned by somebody else now. Although I will say that a bunch of cousins were not happy about that. That they didn't have the opportunity to buy the home. But go through there, and you kind of have this nostalgia for, we used to do things as a family in this location. And so now that I have a couple of my sisters living in a similar environment, I'm like, okay, so we can renucleate around there. If the apocalypse comes, we need to make sure we have enough water to hike at least to the Utah-Idaho border.
Yeah, that's great. That's really nice to have kind of everyone back in one area again. Mm-hmm. So doing just what you need to.
So, well, thanks for your time. I really appreciate it. I wish you the best of luck in things. I hope that your classes go well this semester. And maybe we'll let the world evolve a little bit more and revisit some of these topics in the future again.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me. And I wish you the best in your classes as well. And thanks for everyone who's on right now who watched and put some great questions in the chat. So appreciate you all as well.
Great. Thanks a lot.